Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today for the final panel on AI and ML. My name is Ollie. I'm from Evolution Equity Partners, a startup investor that help best-of-breed B2B technology companies scale. We've got an exciting conversation lined up today, spanning the many benefits of AI and ML in the context of fighting financial crime. I spoke to this panel last week and the enthusiasm for this subject was so clear, so I know it's going to be great today. As we know, technology can help us make sense of an increasingly complex world, but as you hear our panel say, it is not without limitations and risks. Obviously, the future is firmly in financial services and analysts having best-of-breed technology working with human intelligence and meeting the competing high areas and needs for both regulators and customers that need to be satisfied. So let's get started with introductions. Our exciting panel consists of Jana Winter, CIO of Generali, Nitins Solomon, VP of EMEA, Head of Surveillance and Financial Crime Technology of Nomura, and Dr. Stephen Moody, Chief Innovation Officer of Symphony Yazdi AI. Jana, over to you first for introductions, please.
Hello, delighted to be here and to have this conversation. I think of myself as a very practical Chief Information Officer, and I'm always on the lookout of what makes the life of my business and my customers easier. So it is one of the promising areas, fast developing areas, so delighted to be part of this.
Great, thank you. And Nitsan?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So as you said, I am the head of surveillance and financial crime technology at Nomura for the EMEA region. I'm also a member of the advisory board for the A-Team RegTech group. And as part of my role at Nomura, I'm responsible for the technology, data and systems across various compliance areas, be it electronic surveillance, so emails, chats, voice surveillance, trade surveillance, and of course in AML, transaction monitoring, sanction screening, and other areas. And over the past few years, I've seen a lot of RegTech solutions from players big and small. I've led a lot of RFP processes, POC, and really seen this technology sort of come to life. And personally very enthusiastic, and I think that it's really, you know, using technologies like machine learning, AI, alongside proper data management is the way to go when we think about addressing the key challenges our industry is facing today.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Stephen, please.
Thanks, Ollie. Morning, afternoon, wherever you are, and thanks for having me. Very excited to be on this panel. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Yazdi, so I'm responsible for our R&D, run our data science team, and development of new products. I've been working in financial crime, predominantly from the technology perspective, for around 17 years. So I've been through the process of building many of the products in this space. One of the early ones was NetReveal at BAE Systems, which is still, you know, widely used in transaction monitoring, investigation, case management. I'm incredibly passionate about what we can do with AI and machine learning. I think we've just started on that journey. I think the next 5 years are going to be amazing. So a lot of what I spend my time doing is working out how we can use the latest and greatest technology to really make a dent in the problem of identifying well-hidden money laundering schemes.
Excellent, thank you, Stephen. So I thought it'd be great to kind of start here by talking about your own journeys using this technology so far. So perhaps, Jana, you could start by talking about how AI and ML has lived up to your expectations so far, and kind of what you see for the future of the next few years of what has to improve and what that future could look like for you and your organization.
Thank you. So exactly 30 years ago, I was working with the central bank in one of the major European countries. And the exam question at the time was 30 years ago. Let's get aggregate data at a particular level across all of the financial organizations in this major country, analyze the financial data for money laundering detection. And that was 30 years ago. So 30 years later, I would like to expect that things are becoming a little bit more standard of the shelf products, because for us to do this 30 years ago, it was a combination of very advanced university research and very high-powered system integrator implementing it. So I would like to think that at the moment I can be a little bit more with applied mind, where I can use technologies which scale, technologies which can be trained, and technologies which can be adapted to various specific use cases.
Great, thank you. Perhaps Stephen, you'd like to kind of jump in there. I see you nodding your head as you're kind of definitely building one of those systems.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a journey over that time. So I started out, did a PhD in astrophysics, and we had a massive map of the universe. We had billions of galaxies, we had spectral data for all those, we had vast data quantities, and we were trying to work out, you know, key measures of the universe, like how fast does it expand and things like that. So that's where I started off. I moved into the intel space after that, really, you know, finding terrorist patterns, finding spies and communications data. And then I moved into the financial crime space. And I think the key to cracking these problems, which probably still is in the early stages of being solved, is money laundering is a really complex pattern, which is a flow of money, basically. Where does the money come from and where does it go? And it's also distributed across multiple organizations, individuals who are potentially using fake, false identities. So it's a problem of a flow in a really complex shape. And I think actually only fairly recently has the technology been available to really crack that problem. It really is in the last 5 or so years. The new approaches to deep learning, massive scalability, to really tease out complex patterns in those relationships and flows that wasn't available before. So we used to have to find rules and scenarios and kind of work out what we might be looking for and encode those, which kind of works, but it gets very, very complex and very, very hard to manage over time. But now the systems can actually learn those patterns. So I do think there's a big change where we are in the last 5 years to where we were 20 years ago. I think the technology we have now is far, far superior, and there really is a chance to make a massive dent in the problem.
Excellent, thank you. So I think it'd be great to first go to Nitsan and kind of hear again what your journey's been so far to date, in terms of like what's the kind of basic technology and what's going to be sticky, and what actually is the kind of stuff Stephen's talking about is new and needed at the moment.
Well, I think, so just like many other organizations, I suspect, most of what we have been doing is sort of these deterministic rule-based solution. So fairly basic in various areas. And even when we started, I think, talking about this journey of the past 5 years that just has been discussed, I think when you saw solutions 5 years ago, maybe the marketing material was similar to what it is today, but I think the capabilities have certainly been not been as great as they are today. So I think even though we have started implementing things, it didn't live up to our expectations of what it can do. And I think actually, coming at it from the sort of perspective of an organization, I think there is quite a lot that we need to do, sort of financial institutions, in order for these things to actually get to market and be successful. I think one of the problems, when you speak to people and you hear about implementations, often a lot of them are not as successful as people would have expected. And I think one key reason for that is data. So I think organizations don't often understand, the amount of work that needs to go into, doing a proper work on the data, cleaning the data and analysis and bringing it in. That's a huge part of the picture, because it's garbage in, garbage out. And if you don't do that, it doesn't matter what solution you bring in. You can blame it on the solution, but it may not be the reason. And I think the other element is sort of the matureness and operational aspect. So managing these type of solutions is not the same as managing the sort of rule-based models we used to have, or still have in some cases. So you want to make sure that your team is I guess up for the challenge. and now I'm going to bring in our RegTech players here. I think, you know, that's when they come in and where the relationship comes in, which is also very important. It's being able to work together, and you know, we're now starting to see that working successfully for us and for others in the industry, sort of working together and sort of guiding us through the processes of tuning these sort of systems, testing these sort of systems, because it's new and it's not something that's been done before, and the sort of skill set that you have in your traditional compliance or compliance technology departments is often not been aligned to what you need in these type of solutions.
Thank you, completely agree. And Jana, I think I read that you've spent lots of time trying to improve the quality of data you have at Generali and the services you use. So going back to kind of Nitsan's point there, how has that kind of journey been for you, and has it helped you kind of actually look at the complexity and make sense of it through data?
Sure. First, I would subscribe to what Nitsan just said. If you don't have the right data, you can apply all good algorithms, all good machine learning. The result will be corresponding to the quality of the data you have. So I'm going to pick two specific use cases. I'll mention them, but at the moment I'll major on the second one. So the two use cases, one is, and I'm talking specifically in the corporate environment, not talking about the retail environment. In the corporate environment, if you're operating across 70 countries and you have various clients in various countries with various sizes, with various naming, with various identification. So step one is when you get data, you need to be able to process that data very quickly. And the data comes in all formats. We still get, I was just going to say faxes, but maybe not as bad as that. But at least we get PDF files, we get scanned files. You need to be able to process the data fast and at least categorize it quickly to work out what we're talking about without even finding the patterns in that, just being able to process the incoming data. But the second one, and again, I hope that it will just get people interested, is how do I know that my corporate client in territory A is the same as the corporate client in territory B, and they belong to the same parent company? So if I have to check international sanctions, I don't need to go and apply rules. I don't need to go and apply check DNB numbers because they might not be in territory B. So what is my mechanism of matching the data for very specific use cases such as AML and sanctions? So without even applying the AML and sanctions logic, how can I actually identify my corporate customer? And again, back to the rule-based and fuzzy logic. Again, fuzzy logic has been around for the last 30 years, but how good are we at implementing it at the moment?
Excellent, thank you, Jana. But before we kind of move on to the next topic, actually, it's great. We're already getting a lot of questions in. So quickly take the time to ask one to the panel. First one is on the requirement for obviously AI to have training. And the question is, how can you train AML models while the feedback loop from regulators is not closed? The audience members also kind of put, for fraud, I understand usage way better since fraud will be known at a certain point. Happy for anyone to answer that, perhaps Stephen or...
Yeah, happy to, but I'm sure everyone would be really interested to hear Jana and Nitsan as well. So this is a brilliant question. I think AML is much harder than fraud, which is why I'm really interested in it. It is much, much harder than fraud, because fraud, you tend to know at least eventually whether something was fraud or not. It either gets reported by the customer or you get the financial impact. So training models in fraud is quite easy to a certain extent. In AML, it is more difficult, but there is a way of doing it. But it does require a more sophisticated approach. The feedback from the regulators is definitely an issue, but I doubt we're ever really going to get it. So the approach we tend to take in AML investigations is you have to have a supervised approach, but you also have an unsupervised approach, and that's incredibly important, because if you just train it on your historic investigation outcomes, you're biasing what you're doing. You're assuming everything you found before was correct and you didn't miss everything. So you cannot overly rely on supervised training. So the kind of rule of thumb I would say is for AML, about a third of what your model does should be based on historical outcome training, and 2/3 should be on anomaly detection, behavioral analysis, and unsupervised pattern identification. Otherwise, you're going to overly train on those historic outcomes. Then if you look at historic outcomes, at least a lot of the banks tend to grade their AML investigations from no risk, level 1, level 2, level 3, and then finally a suspicious activity report. There's also things that come from tip-offs like unusual activity reports. So you have historic training data, which is graded in different risk. And you can actually do quite a good job of training the model, therefore, on things you're interested in, which tends to be L3 and above. And you can have different mechanisms for the L1, L2s. And what you find is there's actually plenty of information, even in the existing data that flows through a transaction monitoring system. So just the transactions you've got for your existing customers contains about 20 times more information than is currently used. That's pretty much what, when you start applying, the modern AI techniques, there's actually 20 times more information in there, which is not used by the current system. So you can do a very good job at creating an AI model which will focus on your L3s and predominantly just generate L3 level alerts. So if you look at it, rather than generating all the false positives in the L1, L2 space, you'll generally generate L3s. And then your unsupervised model finds things that you don't know. And you do that in a kind of semi-supervised way. You structure the data, you identify all the different behaviors from an unsupervised way, all the different behaviors, create a giant map of all the behaviors that exist in your customer base. And you can overlay your historic investigation outcomes. But you're not training the model on the outcomes. That gives you hotspots in your data where there's behavior that you may have seen a little bit, but there's a whole load of behavior there that you need to investigate. And that's how you find the new things. Couple those two things together and you get a very good AI-driven AML detection system. So that's the approach we take. I've seen it work very, very well, even though you've got sparse, noisy, biased historic data, as long as you don't overly use the historic outcomes and you mix those two techniques together.
Fantastic, thank you, Stephen. And perhaps Nitsan, you'd like to kind of weigh in on this. I think you've mentioned before that AML isn't necessarily binary. There's kind of some nuance in this, and so how are Numura and your team thinking about it?
I think I do agree with Stephen, first of all, about the sort of layering. So, you do, in my view, you would use, first of all, I'll start by saying, in my mind, you still want to keep your rule-based solutions. So, you wouldn't throw them away. They do mitigate some of the risks. So it is important to keep them. And I do agree with Stephen that based on, risk appetite and other factors, you will apply different logic or treat differently your supervised logic and then your sort of more unsupervised. And I do agree with the point that, when you look at the unsupervised, you're being a bit more careful, and you sort of, it's almost a layer that runs on top separately, rather than being, part of the same mechanism, because it is a bit risky. And it is in general, the whole idea, we talked about this before, and I think, AML in general is a world, there isn't a sort of a single truth, if you will. We're not, we're identifying suspicious behavior, and what's suspicious, could be various things, and what was suspicious last month could be, could very well be very normal today. So, it is a challenging area. And it's very difficult to look at that and assess, and it really is just a combination. To my mind, it really has to be a combination of different approaches, and taking them with different levels of risk. The only thing I will say with regards to the view of the regulators is that my personal view is that based on what I've heard recently from the US, the UK, and other places, is that they are today much more accepting and even encouraging of using machine learning and AI. Not only that, I've recently heard quite a few of them say that they will be using that themselves, which, it's sort of, if before we were concerned that what would the regulators say if we do X, today they're saying themselves they are going to do it. And taking a similar approach, doing sandbox, doing experimental things. So, where the methods you're using are that are a bit more experimental, then you would take a bit more of a risk-based approach, and you would use that with caution.
Excellent, thank you. Jana, anything to add before we move on?
There's something that keeps going through my mind, which is good enough. Because in some of the algorithms that we're applying is, again, even measuring the level of tolerance for that particular use case, what we're finding, and the precision, is it good enough? So again, just I did say I'm very practical, but for certain situations, for example, risk engineering, if you apply AI, ML for risk engineering, if you pick out the 70% tolerance, you can already have quite a lot of reports to put your human experts on that. But again, just that whole mechanism of filtering out the good enough.
Great, thank you very much. I think there's a number of questions. Sticking to the last topic, it would be good to, apologies, having a keyboard malfunction. Go on to the next one, which is how do you reconcile data privacy and AI and machine learning? Are there any concerns that by wanting to get less false positives from AI, we could get into data privacy violations? Again, maybe go back to Jana. I don't know if you want to answer that one first.
So the answer is very carefully and very intentionally. And also, I'm going to just pass that on to Stephen in a moment because he's our residential expert on this panel. Another very important subject in insurance is white box and black box. Because there's certain things, for example, for operational improvements. If I know that I'm not introducing bias, if I'm not mistreating my customer, I can do a lot of my operational improvements, just fast processing of straightforward, simple data. But if I know that in certain situations, I need to prove to myself, or my business needs to convince itself that this algorithm, this ML pattern is completely valid, and then prove it to the customer and potentially prove it to the regulator, then suddenly that white box approach becomes very, very important.
Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so the question started with data privacy, didn't it? And then Jana brought up very important part about explainability and how you can understand what the models do and properly regulate the models, white box, black box, clear box, etc. So start off with the data privacy thing. I think that's a really interesting question. And if you look at the regulations in Europe versus the US and what the US has come out with recently, they've actually gone in a slightly different direction there, which is quite interesting. So if you look at the corporate ownership databases, which are going to be public in the EU, so that anyone can use them to effectively mine them for external risk and company data, it's not the case in the US. They're going to be closed and only certain, mainly law enforcement, will get access to them, which is quite weird because you often think of US as more open with data and less about privacy, and the EU more closed with data and more privacy concerns. So they've kind of diverged slightly. I mean, interesting to see which direction they go. I think when it comes to identity and those things, that is a challenge that banks have. And I've heard people high up in the compliance across global banks say, we've got two regulators. We've got a data privacy regulator telling us we can't do it. And we've got the financial crime regulator telling we must do it. And of course, the two regulators don't talk to each other, so you're kind of stuck in the middle. Now, there are ways you can do it. And, a lot of the new fintech companies, because they're new, their kind of global infrastructure has worked with the fact that they're going to be a global organization. They need to share data globally, but you can do it in a secure way. So there are ways you can do it with encryption, hashing, so that you're not actually sharing actual PII data. The challenge with a lot of the banks is they're not really set up to be able to do that. They have all these legacy systems and they'd have to create this entire infrastructure to do it. So they find it a lot more difficult. I think where KYC may end up going, and there's a school of thought which some people in some of the banks we work with have expressed that I agree with. you could identify a lot of money laundering risk entirely from these external data sources and company structures, because companies that are structured in a certain way to enable money laundering will stand out in that if you get access to that data. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. The other thing you can do, and I think it does work, and you should probably, if you're evaluating vendors, is test them out on this. There's a lot you can do with anonymized data. You don't actually need the PII data often to get very good results. If you are really relying on the PII data, then maybe it's not the right approach. You can actually, the data really is in the transaction flows and the money flows. It doesn't, other than when you're looking up on sanctions lists and things, obviously you need to know who they are. But the patterns of money flows and the structures of companies, if they're designed to enable money laundering, they are different to what normal companies operate. And you don't actually need to know the names of the people to work that out. Because also it's very, very easy for criminals, as soon as they're on a sanctions list or a watch list or whatever, to get a new identity and change the name of a company, start another company. It's trivial. So you're on a hiding to nothing trying to track names anyway. And really it's the patterns and the flows of money that matter, which can't be obscured. And you don't need so much PII. So I should probably let Nitins speak because I've waffled on a bit too long there.
No, I think I tend to agree that your only two approaches are either to anonymize or to try and just use it in some sort of a global data set. For us, it's an unresolved. I will say. We are on a journey there. We're not there yet, so I can't comment on exactly what we have been doing. I think there are scenarios where anonymized would be enough, and there are others where you need to consider. To your point earlier, there are two different regulators. So which one are you choosing? And sometimes it does come to that, and we've I've heard discussions in the past of where are we just risk management really, where are we likely to take the risk, to take a higher risk, where would it cost us more, and that's so but I don't I don't have a this is what Namira is doing at the moment. We are not quite there yet.
Great, thank you. Nitins, I was actually just thinking, it's a point we mentioned last week, going back to Stephen's point on regulators. Do you want to quickly discuss here how changing regulations kind of overseas may affect kind of Europe, so like US versus Europe, for the audience?
So how the changes?
Sorry, just how, say, US regulation changing may affect Europe at the same time, or vice versa anywhere else in the world, and how to deal with it.
I think, yeah, so it's kind of similar to the point Stephen made earlier around the registers and the way the expectations from different regulators. So for example, in the context of UBO, so ultimate beneficial owner, so we've seen the new AML regulation in the United States, and I will say it was just sort of a declaration, and it's not definitely clear what is going to be put in place eventually. So it's we're in early days with that, but there are discussions of having of companies having to disclose that information to the regulator. And as Stephen mentioned, there is a discussion of whether or not as far as I know, it's not yet certain that financial institutions would not get access, that they may do. But it is different there and in Europe with the 5 MLD and the registers that are going to be here. But it's a challenge for a bank. And one interesting pointer on that is that some of the countries and some of the regulations, they would define exactly. They will have a definition of a UBO, and that would be what these companies would be mandated to provide. They would have to, tell you who has, 25% or over, of the shares. So very specific definitions. Whereas some organizations, some financial institutions would say, I really want to know who's behind the company, and I really want to know, and it could be somebody controlling the company without having, ownership stake. So I think there are two interesting points to this. One is, how different regulators or different jurisdictions are addressing these areas, and then how different organizations, financial institutions would interpret that, and would they go farther out to try and really dig down and get to the bottom of who the UBO is, or they would just pick it up from the register as it is.
Excellent, thank you. Well, the questions continue to come in thick and fast at the moment, so haven't got any time to pause. If we can, the next one I'll ask is, how do you validate the output of AI/ML models when the humans performing quality assurance disagree among them on the outcome? I suppose there's also going to be contextual with whether you've experienced it with your own organizations, or perhaps even with your clients. So maybe, Anna, would you like to discuss this, and whether, how does your team look at different outputs?
First, it is a very good question. It doesn't have an easy answer, but and that's exactly what I was thinking listening to Nitins, because in our case, say for example, the importance of certain regulations, including AML sanctions, we need to propagate that across many countries, and sometimes we need to do it consistently. So I'm responsible for generally corporate and commercial worldwide. Do you want the same clients to be rated in one way in country A, in a different way in country B? And when the client learns that, they will know where to go for their business. So that consistency is consistency, obviously, of data. That would be great. Consistency of DNB data, that would be great. But actually, it's exactly what the question is: consistency of our own experts. And when you say computer says no, who's going to argue with the computer? And at the moment we are going through a project like that in one of the areas where it's interesting to see what 3 experts say and what 2 ML algorithms say. And then at the end, again, who decides? Is it the 2 ML algorithms, or is it the 3 experts? And it's interesting to, Nitins made a point maybe about 15 minutes ago, how certain things which are abnormal last month may be normal this month, especially with, I'm just going to mention COVID for a moment, because we saw quite a few abnormal things happening in the year since we started. So to be able to process a lot of data, come to the point to say, I have 3 human and 2 machine opinions, but how do I take the best decision, is quite an interesting exercise. I have seen companies, not generally, where it says, computer says no, ignore any human expert, but it's a question, even in a question of culture in the company. And again, would you allow certain countries to be different to other countries if your customers are global? Not an easy answer, but comes down to even culture.
Thank you, that's great. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Sure, I think it's a brilliant question. I absolutely love this question. So I agree with everything Yana said. Some of this is about how you design. Obviously, process design training is very, very important. You will obviously find, though, in a global organization that your investigators are all doing different things, potentially looking at different data sources, doing the investigation a different way, have different training levels, and may or may not agree on the outcome of an experiment. Quite similar to other industries. I always think it's look at what other industries have gone through. If you look in the medical profession, so the same thing with AIs that now can outperform any doctor on looking at an image and identifying certain diseases, because computers are particularly good at looking at those things. The way they test that is, first it would beat one doctor and would generally get the correct answer, and then eventually it would beat a panel of 5 doctors and would get the answer that the 5 doctors would come to if they discussed. So there are ways. It's more tricky in AML because there's no truth. You don't actually know whether this is a financial criminal until they've eventually been arrested and their assets have been frozen. So it's more difficult. But you do have the advantage, particularly for a large financial institution, you can use a trick of having a large number of investigators. So if you, and that's pretty much where a lot of the big players are. They've got a lot of investigators in a lot of countries generating outcomes. And again, this is where the pattern detection is the key thing. You're not overly training it on things you've done before because you're going to bias it, but you identify all the patterns. And then you can overlay your investigation outcomes from all your different investigators on those patterns. And you can actually find anomalies in your investigation outcome. And then you can focus on those areas. So where all the investigators agree, that's great. There's something there. And you can actually identify potential trading needs or policies that may be broken in different areas of the organization, because this team is getting a different investigation outcome on exactly the same pattern that this other team. So they're looking at cases that are very similar, but team A is saying these aren't risky and team B is saying these are high risk. So what are they doing differently? Have they got access to a different system so they can validate it? What's happening? You can actually identify. And even more interesting, on a recent example, you can find subtle anomalies which may indicate you've got insider compromise. Because if you get a weird little cluster of investigators who are consistently grading things as low risk, their behaviors that other investigators, potentially even in different countries, are grading as high risk, you may actually have a different problem with that subgroup. So very difficult, complex problem, but there's a lot of information in the data that your investigators are generating, particularly in a large global business, that you can use.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. On to another question. I think this would be a great one for you to attempt, Nitsan, if you can, which is how do you test the accuracy of a model via a POC with a bank's data, especially when we know the bank's data is confidential? Definitely kind of harkens back to some of the points around privacy Stephen was mentioning earlier as well.
Well, I think there are various ways of doing a POC, and in some cases we've not, I mean, and it really depends on what it is you're running against. But in some cases we have not used our own data at all. In some cases we have used some sort of like a mini on-site deployment where, you know, the data was, you know, sort of stayed on premise. And in some cases, you know, you use some sort of a private cloud. So, you know, it depends really on what you need to do. I mean, ideally, yes, you wouldn't, I mean, in certain POCs where you don't have to disclose the data, and it is possible to do, there are a lot of these problems where, you know, it isn't specific to your own data. And if you need to be careful, right? You want to pick the best solution that does something. So for example, if you're doing sanction screening, you want to make sure that you're using a solution that is able to run against, let's say, if we're a Japanese bank, we're interested, we want to make sure that it can run properly against, you know, Japanese names, etc. But we are a global organization, and in general, usually we wouldn't have, you know, data that is vastly different to other organizations in its essence. So there would be examples where, you know, either you buy an external, I mean, there are various ways to address that, but you use a data set that isn't your own, because the reality is you could actually you don't have to use your own data set to do some of these POCs, and you can, in fact, in some cases, we've intentionally created a specific data set because we wanted to see how the solution would deal with certain examples. In other cases, you would use your own data set, but just mask some of the information, which we also have done in the past. So when it is important and you do want the characteristics of your data to be included, but of course you don't want to share the data as is, there are ways to mask some of the data, to change some of it so that, you know, you can still get a good picture and you can still use your own historical alert disposition in your evaluation. So I guess the answer really comes down to it. It really depends what kind of POC you're running, but I will advise people, you know, it isn't necessarily, you know, it doesn't have to be complex. So not always you really have to get it explicitly against your own data and exactly as it is today, because your data will change anyway, right? It doesn't, you know, so only in certain cases you have to do it. And in these cases, there are techniques like masking and others that you can do.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I mean, from someone who looks at startups as well, there's a number of very exciting kind of privacy solutions, whether it's redaction, anonymization, synthetic data, all kind of novel encryption methods, which are coming through to all kind of facilitate those POCs. I can't believe it, we're already coming up to the end of our time. So I think I'll try and do one more question, which I think could lead to kind of get some good closing points for us. The final question is kind of how can auditors be satisfied with AI and ML tools in the same way that they are with TMS software? And perhaps that could also be a kind of general a general note to talk about what maybe the future looks like, kind of where you are now. Obviously AI and ML isn't perfect, but everyone has to use it. We know we should be using it. So how to get kind of the best out of it. So first, actually, yeah, would be great to kind of maybe go to Stephen, and then Jana and Nitsin.
I think it's a great question. And I think when we get over this problem, we'll have cracked the problem, because this is probably the biggest challenge we've got to get over, is convincing the regulators, auditors, and the senior people in the banks that the system is understandable, and they know and they can control it, and they understand what the outcomes are going to be. I think there's a few aspects. I think there's massive improvements being made in explainability, even for really complex AI models. So I think even, deep learning models that can find patterns in transaction flows now, you can generate an explanation. And I think explanations often can be visual as well. So if you can draw a picture and it starts to come to life, then people can explain it. There's visualization techniques now where you can visualize your entire customer base, and you can see where the risk hotspots are, and you can see what your coverage is, and you can see what you're investigating and what you're not investigating. If you can see your entire 10 million customer base in one picture, and where the risks are and where you've covered and where you haven't, then people start to understand the system's doing something useful. The same with the actual cases themselves. Investigators, generally the toolkits that are available to investigators are not quite good enough to actually make the decision. That's one of the challenges. You get a kind of summary, but you have to dig and pull and find all these different systems. If you can summarize what it is that the system has found visually and make it very, very clear to the investigator and the regulator what it is that it's found and what you're investigating, then the nuts and bolts of how the algorithms, people get much more trust in it straight away. I can understand what that alert means. I know exactly what I'm supposed to look at. I can see why that pattern's risky. There's also that, oh, wow moment of, wow, I would have never thought of that. I never even thought to look for that pattern, but now you've shown it to me. That is interesting. So I think we're on a journey there. I think visualization, new techniques. There's obviously a slow transition from existing things, and I agree with Nitsan and Jana with the transaction monitoring systems. They're going to be with us for a very long time. So the new systems are going to run alongside or before or behind those systems. And when those things have been in parallel and they've lived together for a while, people will become a lot more comfortable, because ultimately it's results. You're going to get a system that is 20 times more efficient and effective than the old way. And you'll keep the old bits that are good, and you'll gradually transition the bits that don't work to a more effective process.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I think it completely is as the explainability of algorithms improves, like this is going to engender more confidence as well. Jana, would be great to kind of hear your kind of closing thoughts here, and perhaps how best kind of AI and ML can be used in your organization and for others.
Just select very specific use cases which would have impact, and try it. Don't just sit back and wait another 10 years. Try it. I'm just going to give you something which I was discussing in a workshop with one of my teams working on the AI, one of the AI projects. I found it really, really curious, literally yesterday. So we receive a lot of risk reports, and we need to analyze them quickly, and we use AI for that analysis. Great. But the expert system that we have trained for certain languages and not for other languages. So we decided to be clever and say, okay, we can use step one, get the, I'm just going to make it up, get the report in Polish, translate it to English, the system is trained in English, run the analysis in English. And it's interesting because if your system is trained for Polish, or Polish translated to English and then on English, it's interesting to see how the same report can bring different data or different analysis. So again, just practical points. You might think you're clever, but it looks like they also language specifics, culture specifics, and all of that is even somehow introduced in risk reports. So still, maybe we can analyze bias upon bias once we have the right technology.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jana. And yeah, Nitsan, finally over to you for kind of closing thoughts.
So I'll go back to I agree with both, and I'll go back to my earlier point around, sort of layering it. So I think, as Stephen mentioned, there would be certain things that are, you would just have as a base layer to just create a certain level of confidence. And above that, I think one thing is you build confidence over time. You build confidence in your system and the solution over time. And I think a lot of people talk about the explainability, but I think, what sometimes they mean is actually the for them to actually understand the system, which is a step back from explainability. It's before you go out and explain it to anyone, do you understand what it's doing? And I think I do agree with Stephen. I think there are solutions that are becoming a lot better at helping people understand what's being done and becoming comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable, you should be able to also explain it to others. And I think there would be other cases where it's absolutely fine not to know what it's doing, because I think there is some sort of like unsupervised pattern analysis where you're just telling the system, just go, just try and get me something interesting. And I think that's absolutely fine, because there is no downside. So the worst case scenario is that it finds something that isn't interesting, which no fault. And if it found something that is interesting, that's great. And then you start investigating from that point onwards. And when you're using a system, and the other side of this is, if you're using a system and you're not yet confident of the results, what you could do is you don't have to take the computer answer as the answer. You could, there are implementations where it's a hybrid, where the computer provides a recommendation, or where only for low risk clients you take the computer output as the truth, and for high risk you take it only as a so there are various ways in which you can play with it, but I think it also comes down to cost versus benefit. So if the computer is going to be and again, you build that confidence, but if you are able to prove to yourself that the computer is going to be right in, I don't know, X% of the cases, and it frees up your analysts to do other things that you need to be doing. I mean, it might be that when you weigh the two options, you will end up in a much better place if you do deploy it, because otherwise you have a finite amount of money, finite amount of analysts, finite amount of time for them to look at things. And we've seen that in the FinCEN files and in other cases. We simply don't have enough resource and enough time to go over everything anyway. And as Stephen mentioned, there would be bias and there would be different views of different humans anyway. So it's not like the machine could get a wrong result, whereas the alternative is we always get the absolute correct result and everything is perfect. So it's just balancing out these two based on risk is how I would sum it up.
Excellent, thank you so much. Yeah, really taking away from this conversation. It's not really perfect, but it can really enable your teams to do so much more. So we've kind of just we should go ahead and embrace AI and ML. I think it's a great sign of a conversation that it feels like we're more at the beginning, despite already reaching the end of our time here today. Apologies to anyone whose questions we didn't get to answer. There was just far too many. We didn't even get to do any of the questions we prepared ourselves. Thank you so much to the panelists again for your thoughts and your time today, and to everyone who tuned in.